Hi, everyone. Welcome to Experiments in Imagination. This session is part 2 of our Rehearsing Futures series. Thank you all for coming down on this Thursday evening. There are a lot of familiar faces in the audience, and we're really grateful to be building with you all, like our HJL community. And there's also some new faces, so welcome. And for anyone who's new to our work, Healing Justice London works on building community-led health and healing to create the conditions for personal and structural transformation. At HJL, we typically like to begin with our thank yous. So we want to thank our speakers, Marai, Abbas, Gabriella, and our chair, David, for graciously sharing their wisdom and visionary practice with us this evening. Little applause. We want to thank the Conway Hall team. We want to thank Grace and Samaya, our incredible BSL interpreters. We want to thank Kin Structures, our curatorial partners. Yes! And I would also like to thank my incredible HJL team. I'm Sarah, HJL's program coordinator, and as someone who's been curating and an artist myself, I was told to make this brief introduction a little bit personal, and I'll just say that this conversation is really important to me, and how I feel this work is such an act of love. By creating new worlds with and for one another, we're creating space for each other to lean into our wholeness, our joy, our humanity. And I'm just going to run through some general housekeeping. So this event is going to run till 9:30, about 2.5 hours with a 10-minute break in the middle. This event is BSL interpreted, and if you need that, you should be sat on the front near the right-hand side. So if you need to move, please do so now. Some important information: if you hear the fire alarm, it will not be a drill. Please follow a member of staff. And also, this event is being live streamed, and that's very important to us, so just shout out to everybody who's joining us virtually today. You can read through our community agreements on the stage. If one of the speakers just clicks the clicker. Thank you. And I'm just going to pick out a couple of community agreements. Capacity to grow. These are ongoing conversations. Not everything will feel resolved. We're practicing and rehearsing these questions. We're leaning in and embracing the complexities and the fraughtness. We're holding the contradictions as part of our practice. Our incredible speakers will speak from their context, but we all need to be in the act of generating and creating the future we're calling in. And as always, the last principle, please remember to hydrate. Tonight's session is the last in our series of public conversations ahead of our festival, Rehearsing Freedoms. Rehearsing Freedoms will be a 4-week Pan-London festival from the 11th of October to the 11th of November. We began this year exploring the potential of somatics for community building and social justice organizing, moving to the need to build life-affirming infrastructures at scale, the importance of community health and people's medicine. And then these past 2 events, Rehearsing Futures, have been about imagining a different future and the use of creativity to think beyond the now. And that's why we're so excited to be hosting this session. I am going to pass over to Eva Yashevich, our movement lead, who's going to deliver a centering practice for us all.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So just going to guide you through a practice. It's totally invitational. If you feel like taking part, that's fine. If it's not for you, that's also totally fine. This is a centering practice that we were taught by Stacey Haynes, who's one of our mentors. She's also on Healing Justice London's board. So it's just a short practice. And yeah, so I'm going to invite you to get as comfortable as you can, whether you're seated or standing. Just take a breath And we're going to be centering in 4 dimensions and 4 principles. And the first principle is dignity, and we're going to be centering in length. And I just want to invite you to, if you can, or if you'd like to, put a hand to your center or visualize a presence of your hand at the center of your body. And we're centering in our length, in our roots, in where we've come from, in being here, in the now, and in the present. And if you can, just sense yourself, feel yourself pulling upwards, just raising yourself higher than you've been today. If you've been a bit scrunched or hard at work or feeling yourself smaller, take up some space and just rise up through the crown of your head. And the second principle that we're going to center and balance in is interdependence. And for this, we're really breathing and feeling into our side body, the sides of ourselves. If you can take a breath, if you feel comfortable to do that, just take up space and air in your chest and sense who you've got beside you, who you're in community with, who's here now with you, and who you're moving with in movement, in your family, in your chosen family, everyone that you're connected to. And feel into those beside you. And then the third dimension, as we're centering, is in depth. And this is the depth of time, of who we've got at our backs. I want you to really feel and sense into your back body. It might be against the chair, it might be against the wood panel of the wall, or you might just be feeling it from your seat upwards, but I'd really invite you to sense who you've got at your back today, and ancestors, freedom fighters, movement builders, people who've come before us, people who aren't with us right now but are fully with us in spirit. Just want you to center and sense who we've got at our backs. And feeling into these dimensions of our length, our width, our depth, I want you to sense the space behind your heart, if you can sense it or visualize it. And then feel about who you've got in your life and what you have, what you're committed to, who you're committed to in love. And sense the front part of your body and your heart and what you're radiating forwards into the unknown, into the complexity, in the complicated, in the future, but with trust and the love and the commitment that's brought you here today and that's bringing you here every day on this earth in interdependence with all life. Thank you for coming. If you've got your eyes closed, you might want to flicker them open, might want to touch your chest. That's what I'm doing at the moment. And just, feel into this moment and this being together here now. Everybody online, we love you too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. That was beautiful. I feel very calm, settled. The perfect way to start us off. I'm just going to introduce David Bailey, who we are so lucky to have this evening. It's really such an honor to read out this introduction and be in the presence of such a visionary. So Fazana, HJL's co-director, who couldn't be here this evening, has often shared how integral and visionary David is and has been. She often quotes him referencing that part in Back to the Future, "The bridge only arrives once you start driving." David is someone who supports so many people, particularly Black and people of color, working class people, to manifest and realize their full selves. And he sees the different imaginaries and the worlds that they can live in. And we know through Fazana that Healing Justice London is an example of that. Part of how David does this is knowing that in the new worlds we want to create, our fundamental need is to be seen and witnessed. David sees and witnesses, and that's what makes him such a visionary, building the desperately needed new cultural landscapes that enable just futures. David is a photographer, writer, curator, and artistic director of the International Curators Forum. He was formerly acting director of the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas in Nassau. David's noteworthy contributions to arts and culture include co-curating the groundbreaking exhibitions Rhapsodies in Black, Art of the Harlem Renaissance with Richard J. Powell at the Hayward Gallery, and Back to Black, Art, Cinema, and the Racial Imaginary with Patrine Archer-Straw and Richard J. Powell at the Whitechapel Art Gallery. David has more recently curated the exhibition Life Between Islands, Caribbean British Art from the 1950s to now, shown at Tate Britain, December 2021. His practice utilizes the Black imagination to vision and bring together alternatives, particularly focusing on the diaspora and global majority people, for new cultures, imaginaries, and landscapes. His most recent award-winning book is Liberation Begins in the Imagination, Writings on Caribbean British Art. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, David. Over to you.
Can people hear me?
Yes.
Wow. Thank you for that introduction. And good to be back as well, actually. It's been a while, so please bear with me. Plenty to do, but always not enough time to do it in. One of the things I want to talk, yes, there is. One of the things I think it's important to recognize, particularly from Healing Justice, is the importance of infrastructure and how one builds infrastructure and how one builds it through, or how one navigates the terrain of infrastructure through the process of, community, individual, collegiate. And one of the reasons why I am a supporter and an advisor for Healing Justice is because one of the things I recognize that it's quite important for us to kind of think about within the 21st century is infrastructure and how we build it and how we build it collectively. And I really want to thank Healing Justice for bringing us together to think about those things, but also having the permanence of an organization which has at its core infrastructure. So thank you, Healing Justice, just for that alone. Secondly, there's also the question about where we are today in terms of our discussion, in terms of the imagination. What's quite interesting is I almost felt like we actually met around 5:30, around that time. I think we almost did the conversation in the green room where we were kind of talking through not so much how we met Fazana and how we connected, but how through our connectiveness, how we actually are rethinking and retooling what we want to do. And it's fair to say, correct me if I'm wrong, we also think about things that are mischievous, because we all like to be mischievous at some times, troublesome, because we all like to be troublesome at some times, but at the same time, quite serious about how we want to kind of think about things and how we want to bring things together. Before I introduce our illustrious speakers, I just want to talk, I've been told I should say something about my work with the ICF, the International Curators Forum, and rather than it be kind of like a long, engaging kind of lecture, I just want to say three things really. One, that building organizations, as you know, isn't easy, but building an organisation which has an international as well as a national remit isn't easy as well. Building an organisation that has a national, international remit with an intergenerational purpose isn't easy, and building an organisation which has an international, national purpose, an intergenerational core, and at the same time a remit which is cross-art form isn't easy, and building an organisation which has an international and national remit and intergenerational at its core and a cross-art form activity with people who are stubborn like myself isn't easy at all. So the idea that we can make things possible means that somehow we have to stretch beyond the imagination. And I'm glad to say members of, well, one key member of my team is here, Jessica Taylor, and I feel that what we are trying to do at the moment is to think through not so much the end activity, but I would say two things, and maybe Jessica, you might say this is wrong. Process and legacy, yeah? What is the processes that enables us to do the things that we need to do, and how do these processes manifest themselves? And what is the context that these processes have to be kind of lived within? That's the first thing. The second thing is legacy. We cannot, and I will stress this and I'll say a bit more about this towards the end, it's important for us to think about legacy in several ways. One is that the things that we, not that we fail about or what we don't plan about, is the idea of permanence, the idea of continuity, the idea that somehow there are things that are somehow living beyond ourselves, which is why the quote that Fazana likes, that I like to say, is the Back to the Future, where they use the fourth dimensional aspect of how one thinks about the future and how one thinks about the legacy in relation to the future. And it's quite important for us to think about that. And I know from today, some of what the speakers have planned to say, think about those ideas around the concept of the imagination, the concept of creativity, the concept of us to dream, that we can dream to change things, is the idea of how we process those things and how we think about legacy. So I will begin by introducing the speakers, but I just wanted to kind of lay that ground down and say that we can only do this through a form of collegiate conversation, which is what we're going to be doing today. So the idea is that through our geniuses that are on our panel today, that we will have a series of interventions and conversations which will lead to a kind of a group conversation, which will then will open up to yourselves. So we all see this as more of a participatory event in relation to that. But enough about me, enough about my chairing. Let me get on with the speakers and let's kind of welcome them, but let me do my introductions, which I have a piece of paper and I've written it down. So, in the order of speaking, and is it Marai Larasi? Marai Larasi.
Still.
I went the other way, didn't I?
Yeah, you did. I forgive you.
Is a black feminist troublemaker and time traveler, which describes with decades of social justice, community organisation and movement experience, particularly in the gender-based violence and enduring violence against black, global minority women and girls fields. A co-founder member of Project Talawa, and the Talawa Theatre Company was just around the corner from here. And those who don't know about Talawa is, don't ask me to do the Jamaican accent, but me little but me Talawa. It means small but big, and I presume it means also big tree, small axe. It's part of that kind of whole narrative, which I think is absolutely brilliant, but which obviously is important to recognise, because not only is it part of the concept of a kind of core conceptual patois from the Caribbean, Jamaica, but it's also a core element of folklore, which has transcended itself through lots of writing and through lots of music, but we can talk about forever. Again, your work is about reimagining and building a resourceful and community initiative, and on top of that, you are a professor of practice at Durham University. Welcome.
Ancestral greetings, everyone. So I'm at the stage of life where I'm perimenopausal, so I forget shit, so need the iPad. So if you see me looking down, it's not out of disrespect, it's just because I literally need to do this. So ancestral greetings, dreamers, time travelers, resistors, weavers, escape artists, humans, more than human. It's good to be here. Thank you for being in this conversation. And being in community with these humans is beautiful. So before I travel with you across the terrain of imagination, I need to offer gratitude and acknowledgements and some other stuff. Because, as the Mandalorian would say, this is the way. So forgive the Star Wars reference. I'm actually more of a Star Trek fan. But it's calm, innit? So I firstly offer blessings and enduring gratitude to beloved ancestors for surviving, for thriving, for resisting, surrendering, loving, for simply being. Ashe. I offer deep gratitude to Healing Justice London for all that you are and all that you create. We are, in this very moment, part of a beautiful experiment in the imaginations of the wizards, alchemists, technicians, artists, curators, etc. of HJL. That we are here right now is evidence of not only the power of radical imagination, but also the necessity of the imagination as a site of action. So thank you, Fazana. Thank you, HJL fam. We, as your beloved community, are blessed by your ongoing willingness to dream with us. In the spirit of rehearsing freedoms, I'd like to situate myself appropriately in this living room of imagination. So like many Caribbean folk, I emerged from the devastation of colonization, determined not to be endlessly devastated, while always bearing the marks, scars, traumas, and inscriptions of colonization on, in, and through my body. I carry the amnesia with me always, like a never-ending psychic lobotomy, and like Chiron's wound, it refuses to be healed. I've become an alchemist, a seamstress, a time traveler. I've learned, like my ancestors did, to make something out of nothing, and to stitch together fragments of memory that I used to line a protective coat of imagination. I have learned to give birth to myself over and over again with my black feminist doulas, including my daughter, guiding me into the world while my son, my black son poet, reminds me that I'm made of stardust. So I was born here in the People's Republic of London to Jamaican parents, and I was raised in the mountains of Jamaica. It is. It is People's Republic of London. It is. I was raised in the mountains of Jamaica where the soil is deep, rich red, and like blood it gives life and it stains. I'm a product of colonization. There's no escaping it. Like sugar, like rum, like modern tobacco. And in this body and this psyche, I carry that legacy. It's one of trafficking, of enslavement, exploitation, hybridity, pain, survival, resistance, and more. My ancestors are those who were torn from the belly of Africa, forced through a gate or a door of no return into the stinking belly of a ship and made to labor in European-owned plantations, built on the lands of the indigenous Taino people, who had barely survived the genocidal project of the Spanish invaders. My ancestors are also those very Europeans who were the architects of this devastation. I therefore come to this conversation as one who's perpetually at the crossroads, spiraling through space and time, moving between worlds, often with more questioning than confident knowing, often with the unsettling, precarious instability of uncertainty. I offer this also as a health warning, as part of tonight's travel will involve references to violence. It may be tender. Please do all that is needed to care for yourself, including disengagement. Imagination isn't always soft or beautiful, and we, especially those doing messy change work, are often holding deep hurt and cause deep hurt. I also want to recognize that the very notion of experimentation can surface pain, perhaps felt more acutely by those who, for example, continue to navigate the medical industrial complex, or those of us who hold genetic memory of being studied, and all of us who continue to live in this social experiment called Babylon. So as a balm, maybe, or as an alternative to those constructions, I offer the following framing. So my adult children are in the room and we play with words all the time. We're obsessed with where did the word come from. So the etymology, the roots of experiment, lie not only in the idea of testing, but in magic, in sorcery. So tonight we will be casting spells in imagination as forming images of, creating mental pictures, sculpting, painting, whatever the thing is. I will visit and reflect on a few sites of imagination, not as discrete categories. That would actually be the most unimaginative thing that I could do right now. But as places to sit, to lay, to rest, and move in and with imagination. These spaces are fluid. They flow into each other and they overlap. Also, experiments are not perfect, despite what Europeans tell us. We will make mistakes. We are not perfect. So the first space is imagination as survival, as escape. As a survivor, not only of systemic violence, but of interpersonal violence, imagination has always been a survival strategy for me, a way to escape, to take flight. And as many of us seek to become more embodied, we know that this project of re-entering our bodies only becomes necessary because we have become skilled in escaping to places of safety in our imagination. Imagination as a survival mechanism is not only an individual one. Imagination is part of the collective escape, marronage, fugitivity. Imagination has felt so important as Black liberation strategy. So on the screen are two of our warrior ancestors, Nanny of the Maroon, who was a Jamaican freedom fighter, military strategist, and Obia woman, and Cecile Fatimon, one of the architects of the Haitian Revolution. They both use spirit work, which involves traversing the dreamscape, traveling between realms, beyond the perceived material realities, inhabiting that which cannot easily be touched. And in Nanny's case, she literally physically moved across the island in both flight and fight. This kind of practice is only possible if you can imagine life beyond the plantation. And so, imagination is also resistance. The ways in which we individually and collectively resist oppression, the ways we choose to refuse, and how imagining alternative liberated realities are rehearsing our freedoms calls us to act, gives life to how we organize, show up or not, take to the streets in protest, curate movement. And here I think of the imaginary commitments of my partner, Sabrina Qureshi, the founder and coordinator of Million Women Rise, led by Black Women for All Women, that's been going for over 16 years. She was and is not only fueled by the righteous anger about the injustice of all forms of men's violence against us, but also the imagined possibilities of who and what we could be as women and girls if we were free. What would it be if we loudly took over the streets in central London? And what if we had a movement space filled not just with the usual familiar feminist faces, but with those women living their ordinary lives, but who are filled with rage and hope? Imagination as a resistance strategy shows up all over our communities, over and over again. And again, I want to honor the work of my sister over there, somewhere in the corner, the work of Baljit Sandhu and the folk at the Center for Knowledge Equity, who continue to reimagine spaces for us which challenge the structures built on single Eurocentric ways of knowing. This leads me to the other space. And if, like me, you use time travel as a liberation strategy, you may well have entered the space of imagination as memory. Now, the root word of memory, nerd, includes, sorry, just tell the truth, includes awareness or consciousness of someone or something. So in this case, I mean memory as mindfulness, bringing into awareness, presencing that which has been stolen, destroyed, forcibly extinguished, searching through the debris, collecting psychic artifacts of who we have been. So I love this image of Black queer bodies adorned, silver plates connecting them to the stars, the rainbow flag, the transgender pride flag, planted in the cane field in defiance of the flags that have been planted on and across our lands. Lee Rose is a Black Jamaican trans man who consistently honors imagination as access to multiple realities. When I spoke to him about this image, it was clear that it was not just about making visible black queer Caribbean bodies who were often rendered invisible through heteropatriarchy. But Lee spoke of the intentional presencing of black queer ancestors in the violent geography of the cane field, where they would have labored, loved, schemed, dreamed, and died. In doing so, this experiment in imagination resists the erasure of colonization and the way that post-colonial nation-states often demand heteronormativity as performance of right citizenship. Lee's work reminds me that for so many of us, to intentionally be in the reimagining is to live in what Valerie Thomas calls the break. Thomas says, the break, the crossroads, and the void signify the potency that haunts the space between forms as hidden genealogy. Vertigo is a signal aspect of the literacy of itutu, i.e. cool, Yoruba for cool. An epistemology of undifferentiated space that holds strategies for negotiating cultural trauma, disruption, dislocation, and hybridity in pointed resistance to colonial erasure. And she finishes with, everything is possible in the break. And so imagination is also free-falling, simultaneous destruction and creation. What exactly is the world that we are designing? And what is the future we are in service to? What gives our practice? Is it business as usual, or is it our imagination? Arundhati Roy opens her book Azadi with a quote from Uruguayan journalist Eduardo Galeano. May tomorrow be more than just another name for today. I want that to sit with you for a minute. May tomorrow be more than just another name for today. So without dreaming, how do we ensure that tomorrow is not that? This, I believe, is one of the most fundamental places for us to be willing to collectively experiment in wild, courageous imagination that goes beyond the certain, the known, the familiar. And so I also want to acknowledge the wild community at Langkelly Chase Foundation. Some of you may have heard some news. The organization is dismantling itself and moving the money to community. So I want to acknowledge that community for the choice we have made to dismantle the organization, to compost, to allow for creation which doesn't center the usual power holders. I'm getting close to the end, don't worry. I also must speak to the work of Project Talawa, a black feminist community resourcing initiative, which is literally an experiment in imagination. We were born from black feminist unapologetic dreaming. Some of the dreamers are here in the room. So here's a screenshot for a website. We openly speak about dreaming. We are clear that we are dreaming liberated futures, not for the reconfiguration of capitalism or the ableist imagination of so-called perfect bodies and all of that shit, but one where we breathe and live in accountable freedom and where we emerge from the current collapse, humbler, wiser, more tender, and fully able to honor Mama Earth. And so when we share resources with energy and the hope of the dreamscape. Finally, the final resting place is imagination as healing and being. Imagination can be such a space of healing, restoration, allowing ourselves or humanity. Imagination is also a place of rest. Imagination is in and of itself worthwhile simply for itself. So before I close, I'd say, imagination is courageous labor. Those of us who have claimed the space of imagination intentionally are witnessing that now you have funders, for example, starting to notice this, which is great, but also calls us in to remember and deepen our boundaries, to practice with increased consciousness, to nurture our dream spaces, know what is sacred, not everything must be spoken, know who it's safe to dream with. And I leave you this from Black Liturgies, a quote from John Edgar Wideman, do not fall asleep in your enemy's dream. And be careful who you let regulate your hope. Liberation is after you. And all dreaming is dangerous to those who benefit from our numbness. Ashe.
Okay. What can I say? I've been making notes. So, lots of things that we can think about in terms of your presentation and your kind of intervention and your thoughts. The idea that the moment of imagination is a site of action, I think that's an important one for us to think about. Like the idea of like somehow giving birth again and again and again, and I like somehow that in connection with the idea of Renaissance, the idea that Renaissance is rebirth, but for us, 21st and 20th century, we have been in a Renaissance moment from time. Yeah, the idea that somehow, you know, love your references to sci-fi and the fantastic. You know, the whole space-time continuum is just you're just on it. So and just linking that to the colonial is yeah. I just thought you're just in the zone, aren't you? And but then the idea that, you know, the pain from experimentation, yet the conjuring, the magic, the sorcery, the casting of the spells, you know, the idea that it's not perfect, the whole experimental project, you know, the idea that it's also about survival, the imagination of survival, the imagination of, you know, of the mechanisms of survival, what are the strategies, the survival strategies, the resistance strategies that come without that. Brilliant example of Nanny, who, is like the embodiment of all of those things you've been talking about. You are blessed, the idea of memory, and I know this because you said it in there, the idea of failure to remember. I'm going to come back to that, but the idea that you came back to the idea of memory was really, really important for me, and I think for all of us. The idea how somehow we can reimagine through memory, but also bring to the fore, you know, our Black queer ancestors through memory and reimagine it through memory, but also we can allow creation in that process. And that, you know, love the idea that there are dreamers in the room, you know, the Talawas of all of us that are here today, and that, you know, somehow healing, and there's a restoration process, and there's a place of rest. I think we can all go home now from hearing that. Literally, that is like, you've nailed it. Unfortunately, Gabriella and Abbas, you have to follow that. So let me introduce Gabriella Gomez-Mont, who is, so I need to keep this closer, don't I? Sorry about that. Gabriella, who has been recently conversing with, you know, you have been with Fazana recently, and hello, Fazana, and wish you were here. And maybe we should hear a bit more about those conversations you've been having with Fazana just recently. But also love the idea that your work explores and reimagines the environments and the cities that we live in. And one tends to forget that the kind of the model for the 20th and the 21st century is the change between the rural to the city, and how the city and how the urban complex becomes another site for the psychologies, the psychosis, but also the idea of how we want to imagine the bodies of people of colour as well as people of non-colour. So it's important that that work gets acknowledged, particularly in your work, Experimentalista, is that how I think it up? And which was a lab to tackle urban challenges. It's what I was saying before, somehow we need to join all these dots together. As a director, Gabriella, you've headed a highly transdisciplinary team spanning urban geographies, political scientists, internationalists, lawyers, civic tech experts, artists, historians, future thinkers, philosophers, amongst others. And really, you should be admired in terms of how your work builds and redesigns cities that are anchored in feminism and care in Bogota, as well as your work deeply rooted in Colombia and Latina feminist practice. And I'm so glad that you are here and you're actually making London your home as well. Welcome, Gabriella.
Thank you. I must say it actually is a very hard act to follow, because we will sandwich cities between poetry and more poetry and then a megalopolis. So thank you so much, David. Thank you so much for this introduction. I'm incredibly happy to be here. And yes, London is becoming home, but perhaps still where my umbilical cord is buried, the big stubborn love of my life, Mexico City, where I was born and raised. And as many big loves, I think it has both inspired me as well as broken my heart many times over. And as all big loves, it has also created a series of transmutations and transformations in my life. Perhaps the most important one is turning me from an artist, documentary filmmaker, cultural producer into a government bureaucrat. So that is actually love for you. So in 2013, out of a completely serendipitous or absurd turn of affairs, whatever your choice of the universe is, I got invited by the next mayor of Mexico City to become a creative bureaucrat. So since I could invent my job, I decided I would become the chief creative officer for Mexico City. And as such, I headed Laboratorio para la Ciudad, which is lab for the city. And as you probably know, this is not necessarily the first or the last lab the world over. We have the same ethos, which is basically how do we give a testing ground to governments where they can try out new things and also bridge civil society with the apparatus of government. But as you can also imagine, since we were the first lab in the emerging world and in a megalopolis, Mexico City, which I call home, gave us a very particular taste. So for those of you who have not been there, Mexico City, everything is in the superlative, as is in London in many ways, perhaps even more so. So 22 million people in a metropolitan area. We have 5 million kids as well, which is basically under age 14, which is basically the size of Denmark, just of children, 5 million people going through just one subway station, the former billionaire #1 of the world, now paltry #7, but then also one of the lowest minimum wages in the world. So it is a place of abundance and too muchness in the most beautiful ways, but that diversity can also translate into divisiveness. So when we stepped into government, this was actually one of the questions that kept me up at night. Because of my cultural background, we weren't going to do government or policy in the traditional way. And I had fabulous people accompanying this journey. I had more or less 20 people on my team. Half of them came from the humanities, the other half came from the urban sciences. So as David mentioned, it was everything from urban geographers and lawyers, administrators, political scientists, internationalists, but also philosophers and artists and designers and filmmakers and writers and historians, and everything that we did sat in between, because we really wanted to go against this technocratic view of a city and bring back imagination and bring back first principles. How do we want to live together? How do we want to move together? How do we want to be healthy together? Back into the very entrails of government. And of course, being Mexico City, I even had a mass wrestler on my team. So, you know, political scientist, government person by day, and mass wrestler, defender of pedestrian rights by night. And it wasn't until The Guardian ousted him that we actually made it known that he was both things. But I actually think Jorge exemplifies beautifully the ethos that we wanted to hold at the lab, where this is serious business, like our societies, our cities, inequality, all of these things are very serious, but perhaps we also have to bring in that other space of poetry and imagination back into the place of our cities. So this is the things that we wanted to entangle very deeply and to trouble. The urban, the political, the social, the creative, and really think about the tensions and the translations both between civil society and government, but also how do we start thinking about new urban languages and political forms? How do we think things differently? How do we imagine differently? And there was this big question that we had, how do we build cities not only for the human body, but also for the human imagination? Would that change things in any way? And we love to think that we specialize in the gaps. So we were trying to have the conversations that were not being had, to bring in the voices that had not necessarily been heard, and go way beyond, as I mentioned, like a technocratic view of a cities where city only gets translated into numbers. And so our biggest strategy and the most important one, especially being a small team in a gargantuan city and a government body of 250,000 bureaucrats, and we were 20, was how do you actually gather communities around questions, like burning questions, restless questions, questions that would take us places that we didn't necessarily know where they would lead. So that is supposed to be a very different type of image, but so basically the types of communities that we gathered, but it's actually telling, were everything from hackers to big universities in Mexico City, to neighbors in every type of neighborhood to designers, but we also love to work with unusual suspects and bring them deep into government as well. So this is one example of an amazing artist called Gilberto Esparza, and this is what he calls nomad plants. So basically this is a functioning, real creature object, which is half plant, half robot. It has hydrophiliac legs, which it means it can sense the humidity of the land, so it walks towards rivers on its own. It's completely autonomous. It sinks its mouth into the river, takes for granted, unfortunately, that rivers nowadays are polluted, so it purifies it, feeds the plant, and the plant in turn feeds the robot, and if you try to touch it, it runs away. Kind of clunkily, but it runs away. So basically, what does this have to do with government? But in many ways, I think that we've lost the sense of provocation and of poetry and of possibility within government. And so basically, instead of going up to communities and saying, okay, you should not wash your clothes in the water because it pollutes, and be self-righteous about it, what happens when actually the entry point, for example, is the kids? When you actually first instigate the imagination, that first space of movement for any sort of social transformation, and then a different type of conversation follows. So we really thought it was interesting to fold in people like Humberto, who could actually also teach us about world hinting as well. Like these small little points in time that can help us imagine otherwise in many ways. And that actually led us to do a lot of deep thinking about the importance of experimentation, which is obviously one of the subjects that brings us today. So I'll give you one example of hundreds of experiments that we did during 6 years. But so basically Mexico City, as I said, is a place of superlatives. This is the biggest informal bus system in the world. So it has 31,000 of these green creatures, and believe it or not, they actually move an astounding 14 million individual rides per day. The issue with this is that until very recently, you could actually own one of these individually. And we knew where they started and where they ended, but since Mexico City sprawled 35 times in size from the 60s to the 90s, we suddenly lost track and had no idea what was happening in between. As you can imagine, as a policy person, there's two huge issues. One of them is, how do your citizens get around? And the only way really, for any of you who have been in Mexico City, you know this, is asking 5 people, averaging out, and then just giving it your best shot. And it's actually impossible to drive policy, and only 30% of the population of Mexico City owns a car. So imagine that you actually don't have the information that is necessary. So this was a delicious experiment, because an experiment is when you don't know the outcome. This is not a best practice. This is not innovation. This is just like not knowing how the hell we're going to get to the other side. That is an experiment. And so basically we did what we usually do, which is bring together a group of people of all sorts of disciplines, walks of life, et cetera, and we came up with an idea of saying, okay, like what would happen if we actually gamify this? Like one of the things that we have is a lot of people and a lot of civic energy in many ways. So we created Mapaton and did a technological app with Krieger, which is a young tech company, civic tech company at the time. And then basically we said, okay, we're actually going to invite people to map from beginning to end of the routes, and you will gain points. And then basically everything will be uploaded. We would simulate GTFS. It was actually quite sophisticated technology, which is basically the data standard for mobility. And then we will hopefully have a first map of the informal bus system of Mexico City. So to our big delight and surprise, we had more than 4,000 people signing up, more than 700 teams. Not an easy feat, because we actually found out that some of these routes actually were 8.5 hours to and fro across the city. So, I mean, this was a true commitment. This, I'm happy to say, is the first map of the informal bus system that Mexico City has ever had. It's more or less like 75% complete. And basically, we mapped in 2 weeks the equivalent of a turn and a half around the circumference of the Earth. And these are the people that helped us map it. These are the 100 winners. They're all users of the transportation system as well. And basically, what Mapaton taught us was several things. First of all, your community is your superpower. The second one is that many times for places like ours, like Mexico City, the emerging world, sometimes we're catching up with places. London doesn't need to do this. It has GPS on all of your beautiful double-deckers. But basically, we can actually help leapfrog into the next conversation. So I was also very happy when Beth Novick, who was the CTO under Obama, actually wrote an article talking about the future of government and actually mentioned Mapatón as one of those examples of collaboration between government and civil society. So this is actually one of the things that Farzan and I deeply believe in, and we've had so many delicious conversations about the idea of rehearsal. Because any of these exercises is a possibility of rehearsal, of rehearsing society, prototyping the way that we can collaborate, and that we can actually solve urban challenges in this case. And it also leads to a certain sense of politics of possibility, if you will, that I think has to be part of the political conversation again. And most importantly, I think that this very much leads to a very important thing, which is that democracy in and of itself might be our desire to be part of a larger story. So how do we enlarge this we in every time more interesting ways? One of the most beautiful excuses that we had, because that was like a small-ish experiment, was crowdsourcing the Mexico City Constitution, which was a first not only for ourselves, but actually for the world. Talk about also another experiment. And basically, a city constitution is a very interesting place and point, talking about imagination, because first of all, it's a beautiful excuse for a society and a city to think about who we have been, what our DNA is, but also what is a city that we want to become. So it is a sense of, like, it's ideology in the best of ways, it is dreaming together in the best of ways, but it's also a series of rights that basically, in Mexico at least, cannot be taken back because of the way the constitutional law works, is that once a right is granted, it cannot be taken back. So basically, we got to have more than 500,000 people crowdsourcing the Constitution. I won't get into it, but we have nowadays everything from gay rights, transsexual rights, indigenous rights, right as a mobility, abortion, all sorts of things, euthanasia, just like all sorts of things that nowadays will be rights for all the future generations of Mexico City. And another example that I love as well, that we worked very specifically on Article 20 of the Mexico City Constitution, is that we actually made Mexico City into a sanctuary city. So if you followed when Trump was still a president, talking about, dreams and nightmares. So if you followed in his half term, he was just demonizing a caravan coming from Central America. And the reason why when the caravan hit Mexico City, instead of being received by the military, by the police force, it was actually received by these kind of weird pink little trucky things, which was actually doctors and health support and food and a place to stay, was because we made Mexico City into a sanctuary city, which means that nobody is illegal. So what does this mean? Is that a constitution is capable of helping us dream out loud a city, but it also brings about a way of being a city that is both legal as well as an idea of who we can be together. Knowing that I'm running out of time, I'll give you this last example as well from my time in Mexico City, also related to the Constitution, and that will hopefully give us a bit of food for thought today. Besides the crowdsourcing of it, we decided to have what we call the Urban Imaginaries survey. And so basically we queried 31,000 people across 1,400 neighborhoods and asked them, what are the biggest the things that you most love about Mexico City? What are the biggest challenges? And most importantly, how do you imagine the future of Mexico City? And even though we were actually prompting for positive futures, one of the things that we realized is that most everybody wrote back about Mad Max apocalyptic scenarios that started off a really important conversation within the lab. Should we care that our imagination nowadays is more apocalyptic than not? And I actually think we should, because again, the imagination is the space of first movement. As David had said, imagination is the first space of liberation. No? So what does it mean when we have our boundaries to imagination, and when our imagination has been sequestered by more neoliberal, capitalistic, corporate agendas? One of the very few imaginaries that we have the world over is the smart city thing. These are not images that I picked. These are the first images, and that's 10 pages in. If you say future of cities, is that really the future of cities that we're envisioning, and that they look nothing like the life and the cities I think that we most love? So how, in sum, do we not only think about the objective data and the objective reality of cities, but actually how do we bring about this moment we can also start thinking about the subjectiveness of our collective life and the way that mind anchors to matter, and know that all of the movements, all of those possibilities, many times, again, like first start in our capacity to imagine, and that cities, I think, cities like London, cities like Mexico City, can be really interesting exercises of thinking of the pluriversal in Arturo Escobar and the Zapatista movement words of unity through diversity, because many times the only thing that we have in common is a city and its future, but sometimes it's actually, many times, hopefully, what can bring us together to imagine out loud. Thank you very much.
Is this on? Oh, for somebody who just flew in 36 hours ago and is jet lagged, that is remarkable. Lots to think about. Those of people who know about Mexico will know about the density and the urbanization of the density of that space and what Gabrielle is talking about. I kind of like the idea that you talked about the artist to the bureaucrat, because I think we're all there. Mm-hmm. We're all part of that process of, and maybe this is something we could talk about a bit later on today, about how we move, how we shift back and forth between the artist and the bureaucrat. Mm-hmm. And I know that's something that definitely kind of hits with me as well as hits with many of our other speakers as well. Love the idea of the testing ground. Love the idea of like, how do we want to live together? Mm. I thought was quite a really important question. You know, very simple but a very complex question. You know, what is the possibilities and how we want to live together? You know, and if that's the case, what are the new urban languages? You know, what are the new political forums which you spoke about? You know, how we can build cities for the imagination. That's quite important. I feel like you're almost saying a kind of circular thing about somehow we're mapping cities for the imagination, but also saying at the same time, the city is the imagination. Do you see what I mean? You're like this. You're having this kind of recurring kind of debate about those two things, which actually they are one and the same thing. Love the idea of unusual suspects and the robotic mischief. You know, that was absolutely, I thought was brilliant. Experimentation, very, very important. The project of mapping the bus system, that is remarkable. And the idea of somehow, you know, again, this is the artist. Again, this is like, I would say that's a relational art practice project that uses like technology, participation, in relation to that. Community is your superpower. Yes, indeed. Everything about what you've been talking about, which I feel has echoed what's been said previously before, is about the shift between the micro and the macro, the artist, the bureaucrat, the city, the imagination. It's this expansive idea that we can move across the micro and the macro. And love the idea that we are part of a larger story, which is absolutely true. So, brings me to our last speaker, which is Abbas Zahedi, and their friend, I have to say. And you are written about as a...
Warned me.
We talked about this before, didn't we? This is the mischief that's happening, isn't it? Okay. Abbas, you're noted as an artist and cultural worker, navigating the personal and the collective histories and how you interweave them. I also like to add, in relation to that, you are a true artistic diasporic animator. It's a phrase I've only used a few times, but you live that life. And I feel like you do that through your cultural practices, how you imagine, how you grieve through your process, and how you bring people together. You talk about hijacking galleries as spaces to grieve. Well, I think anybody who saw your show at the South London Art Gallery in 2020 how from a why would really understand that kind of process in relation to that, of how you've taken that space and kind of returned it into something quite extraordinarily different. Really, your interventions and how you create new relational infrastructures that help us have different relationships with ourselves, our others, and our space has always been welcomed, and it is most welcome today. So you have the floor, my friend.
Can everyone hear me? Am I coming through the mic? Or yeah, there we are. Yeah, okay. I'm going to be quick because this is something I want to try, and I don't know how long it takes. Yeah. I have pictures and words, So, yeah, this is last October, the Frieze Artist Award piece that I did. I created a kind of pavilion in the shape of a bus stop from Central Asia outside of Frieze in the park, and hosted an open mic in there every day, like a pirate radio station. And we streamed that into the fair, and inside the fair it looked like this. People just sit and listen. So actually, to me, that was a way of hacking Frieze. And open mics for me are very important spaces to grieve. Like often poets are expressing their grief and dealing with the shame around grief. So this is a painting my dad did. I didn't know my dad made paintings, but I put it in a police station. This is my DNA, like where it comes from. And it's the Diaspora Pavilion. David and Jessica, they did that. It's my first ever art show in 2017 and in Venice. And these are some lemons. Usually on Thursday evenings I go to therapy, but this Thursday I'm here. And I missed the chance to speak to my therapist for like the 700th and 99th time. And she keeps advising me to stop suppressing my anger. And I told her that I put it in the work. And she asked me, does that ever work? So I'm like, look, in today's era, the most important commodities are emotions, feelings, and affect. They've become the primary modes of production. And so as a way to get away from this, I took the humble lemon as a paradigm shift. I mean, we all know that lemons are somewhat indigenous to ancient Persia, for it was there that citron became known to Greek botanists accompanying Alexander during his campaigns. The westward spread of the lemon to the eastern Mediterranean region came from the ancient Greeks and most likely my Jewish kinfolk who became acquainted with its flesh during their exile in Mesopotamia in the 6th century BC. Citron is the only citrus mentioned in Middle Persian and ethno-futurist sources. According to the cosmologies of Zarathustra, it's one of 10 kinds of fruit that are both edible inside and outside. Hence, the Mobius banding of the lemon became a virtue against the dualistic cosmologies of Manichaeism. Friedrich Nietzsche's invocation to go beyond good and evil follows on from this, as he articulates the perilous conditions of the modern individual. A detour inviting us to discover post-humanism before any kind of universal human rights. Maybe, quite possibly, everything I know about lemons comes from when I was in East London making lemonade. I'd zest a room full of winter, juice a storm for April's fools. 50 liters was the bare minimum, so I'd wipe the altar. May the God of small batch relativity be pleased with my handmade in Hackney hackery. Wash, cut, press, repeat. Upon her dress, tears that turn the scent of citric acid to egg. All I need is a sieve. Pouring pulp from a height releases volatile gas, ignites the room with the smell of rotting sulfur. I can't remember her smell. Flesh turned grey, dressed in green. 50 liters is what we need. Cerebrally, I know I'm meant to be out by 5. Home time used to be free. Spiraling downstairs into a balloon-like bag of a heart. Now it's just time to depart. Nursing hands that beat to the anxious base of a bag-like brain, falling out of shape. Wrap the bottle around. Recycle glass, no end, spirit so sound. Let me borrow its resilience. A few shards never hurt no one. 5:15. I got the big headphones on. Stay the fuck away. Don't they know I need 50 liters? How I wish it were thousands. How I wish that life were just lemon, not segments of flesh tortured in the physics of process. Contrast neo-pagan nature worship with elders from way before the slave ship. I wear a beard and drink piss for breakfast. Roam around in antioxidants, I'm anti-oxygen. Free radical, seeking some kind of means well that ends well, and will rediscover the ancient, distill its sediment. Bring me the unprocessed, no filter. I see clear under the filaments, data. In between remains of sand, flown in and out by a drone from whose homeland. Inflate the price of oil like quinoa in Ramadan. I am a postmodern frontiersman, / democratic aristocrat, gentle gentrifier of brownfield brick. What do you believe in? She replied, I'm a raw foodist, 83% vegan. Used to be veggie, but then I cut dairy. This blender pre-digests all my food for me. I mix the rest with indigenous chromosomes, rare specimens of saccharin, down like shots to get a deep cleanse. There's an online shop. I can refer you as a friend. You just need to type in this code. Can you help me uncode those recipes that you keep in your home? At least tell me what the Arabic says. You're from West London. So what? How does that make any sense? There was no place for me in your economy until you democratized saffron, turmeric, and pomegranate tea. Plus, these days, you need a degree just to juice lemon. This is serving soup in Tate Britain. This is an exhibition that was closed due to COVID, so it became a space for doctors and health workers and frontline staff. This is a life support machine. It's in my current exhibition in Nottingham Contemporary. I borrowed it from a hospital. If someone needs life support, they take it out of the exhibition. The show's about failure, like, you know. Failure. That's the state that my heart's in. Not cardiac blood, bypassing ain't gonna fix this. Can't see through the thickness. Vessels diseased, drown in the sickness. Tell me, blood, how come it come like this? Her reply was something like, I am the strongest whisper that ever came close. Enter the ego, eject to my dose. Forget your limits, I'm a limitless foe. When the limits are higher, when you feel low. How low can you go when your Lambo lifestyle's in limbo? Aspirations have taken hold that aspirate the contents of your soul. Into the ether, chased away by the reefer, intertwined with the scent of Shish al-Fakhr, dreams of becoming a Khalifa. Married to Amber, or one of those who rose and fell with the type of desire that could not be quelled. I'm a hyper supplier of all this unreal. And thus spoke Zarathustra, one of the ancestors. They said it's dead. It's all dead. So if you concur, then let me see you nod your head like this. Bounce to the beat, sincere, discreet. If you watch my feet, you'll see it moving nearly, clearly. I'm stuck between the vibrations emanating from me, but they are not me. I'm wrapped in the ropes of rhythmic geometries, unwrap my hope so that you can call it poetry. Allow me to decipher realities between fake identities and true fallacy. With these words, I watch me fade into the distance. Shrouded by nonsense, I lurk in shadows, planting seeds from the fragments of my subconscious sub-frequencies, which gain their permanence in the residual resonance of my vocal firmaments. And I know that the flow is rotten. It's old. I've forgotten everything. I no longer know how to sing, so I wrap my brain in a sling, awaiting a melody, a remedy, 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 a melody, a swimming in a sea of boxed-in vocabulary, my inbox said, "Come to Conway Hall, talk about imagination." So recently, I was thinking about how during the pandemic, they were looking at data, telling us when we can be free. And it reminded me of when they told my neighbors to stay in the tower as it continued to catch fire. Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Tory MP, said they should have listened to official advice, and they should not have listened to official advice. Sorry. Yeah, he said don't listen to officials. And you should have just exited the building. That's what you do if you have common sense. And I was there all night, standing outside Grenfell 6 summers ago. I still got messages on my phone telling Khadija that the fire brigade is telling her to stay home. And I lacked common sense. I didn't realize that anti-immigration policy this far. So I backtracked and told her, get out as quick as you can, but it was too late. How do we forgive ourselves for the mistakes that we made? These lot are telling me when life gives you lemon, blood, I say, fuck lemonade. This is the rest of the exhibition. I put steel beams in to support the gallery walls because I think that's what we do. We supporting them maybe more than they support us. Yeah, and sometimes you make them look good. Yeah, it's called conceptual art because I don't know. Yeah, maybe I'll talk about this later. It's an insurance policy. And yeah, okay. The insurance policy if the building collapsed, because the artwork would fall down and then we could pick it up and sell it and rebuild the building. Once upon a time in 1972, there was a famous estate that got blown up in St. Louis, Missouri, and this signified that postmodernism had arrived, such that we now speak of Vegas with the same reverence as Versailles. Those housing projects were conceived and designed by Minoru Yamasaki, who also gave the blueprints for the World Trade Center that opened in 1973, a whole year later. So I think it's now possible to see why some would say today, the way up and down are one and the same. This alludes to my own discovery that manna from heaven is just as nutritious as manna from below. The machine-aided neural networking of affect, manna, is an acronym somehow familiar but at the same time quite technical, but it's just a process that makes up for the fact that we, the former neo-diaspora, do not inherit Immanuel Kant's Copernican turn, the KCT. His head start into enlightenment, being an individual and modernity, we've been precluded from a life of such liberties because the neo-diaspora function better online as a live archive, a kind of schizo embodiment to cope with the fact that in today's towers the flames are high-rise, yet you still cry because Venice is sinking, exacerbating the paradox in which we are left to burn or to rot. Once upon a time, at the end of 2014. My therapist recommended I go to Hackney and join a bakery, do a placement. I thought it was because I was an artisan, but no, it was for those who were struggling with their mental healthiness. I went there and became curious about everything. At the same time, I was working in Selfridges, cosplaying a migrant chef chopping onions in the basement. My English was too good though, so I started to face problems. Subsequently, I quit my kitchen role to move on from the bakery to a brewery. Started a 2-year stint in drinks production with a side of hipster anthropology. I became really good at lemonade. This involved a lot of hard, repetitive, some days I would produce up to 80 liters of juiced lemons by hand. Whilst doing this, I was also undergoing a prolonged phase, struggling with a nervosa. I began to treat it like a machine, the body. Prolonged bouts of fasting, calculating the molecular weight of everything I put in and put out. I became like the machines which I would fill and empty. Plugged into my headphones, listening to streams of liquid curated by tendencies, algorithmic. I did this until I reached the final crit of my fine art master's degree, and my tutors instructed me to speak less of my past, somehow make it go away, especially when it came to the coveted enterprise of practice. At first, I was excited by the freedom this offered to be civilized instead of just cultured. I felt that I could now sit within a canon of formalistic forms and formulations, a place in which identity no longer functions because my past is heavy. It's too much of a burden. People can't relate to its particularities, the punctum of its weight. They can't see why I would choose to wash the walls and floor of a gallery with rose water. I mean, if I'd chosen to work with piss, then they'd be like, yeah. We have an entire tradition of this, from Diogenes to Serrano, not forgetting the Pollocks and Brian Enos. But they can't relate to a past in which I washed the dead corpse of my younger brother with an infusion of myrrh and rosewater. A coming-of-age ritual that was intended to make me a man because there was no time to be a feminine orphan boy child. I've been told that speaking of the past is bad form, improper etiquette, so I speak of lemons instead. I speak of how Deleuze's refrain was born out of Nietzsche's eternal return, a cyclical expanse of time in which the past is forever relived. I made my own version, called it a live archive, to refer to how technology works to both canonize and revive packets of data into network streams of blah, blah, blah. My past is a problem. Let's speak of Fluxus, Koprov, and Duchamp instead. Because my past is rosen stem, bloody and red, passed down by cinnamon tongues that would shoot for the sun as they watched vultures descend upon their dead. I come from all manners of fear and dread, from pieces of earth that swallowed everything I ever loved. So I beg you to tread gently, and next time you speak to the ground, please ask if it remembers me.
Abbas, thank you for not going to your therapy session. We're all, yes. There's lots in there. And I have to say that all three speakers, what I've really enjoyed, and I hope you've enjoyed as well, is just how eclectic the reference points all of you have brought to this conversation. I mean, the idea that somehow moving Abbas from a space to grieve to poetic mediations on lemons, which involve the individual to the cosmos, that relate to kind of grounded historical non-realities, realities with Persia, and of course your physical work with Lemons is all grounded. As the point that you ended with is literally grounded within all of that. Your kind of wordmanship on just the commodification of culture is just, yes, I just can't say anything more than that. And how you just, in the midst of all of that, can talk about failure, but also can think about how we can track these things. Is it possible to track these things through personal testimony? Is it through personal testimony that we can speak of the past? And how do we kind of speak of the past when we're moving forward, when there's a trend-setting genre of the hipster, the postmodernist, the philosopher that's actually trying to race ahead of us? But most importantly, thank you, Abbas, for bringing the idea of that words themselves and your playfulness and kind of weapons of wordsmanship can actually distangle, but also help us to reimagine at the same time. I'm speechless, but yes, for all three of you. So hope everybody's had a break, refreshed, has been able to process at least some of the things we've been talking about. Given the time restraint, I want to just ask one question, which I want to carry through with the panel. And what's interesting is it's a question that organically came up through Gabriella, through the break. But it's also something that's being referred to a lot. So I'm going to just ask you to give your thoughts in relation to the central topic about the imagination, around the question of shapeshifters. The idea that not so much the question of the sci-fi shapeshifting, but that is also part of that. But the idea that somehow things that shape us, but also you've all talked about the mercurial way in which you've navigated ancestral to, the urban, to the folk, to the natural aspects. So in some ways, you've all alluded to the question of the shape-shifting nature of all of your practices and your thinking. And do you think this is something which can benefit in terms of us thinking about this question about, the imagination? I mean, I'm going to leave that one out there, and whoever wants to come in on that can. Or if you think that's a crazy question, let me know. Go for it.
Okay, so is this thing working?
Yes.
Okay. It wasn't accidental that I started with Nanny of the Maroons. One of the things that she is remembered for is her shape-shifting. So the way she made herself visible, invisible, the way she reconfigured herself intentionally. And I think there is a requirement as part of imagination to do that. What there is how do we do that? How do we engage with the inevitable collapse? And which parts of ourselves do we keep intact? Because shape-shifting isn't without its impact. It has consequence, because we are that bit where I said I'm birthing myself over and over again. Like, that's joyful, but that's also painful. And one of the, I'm really missing Fazana right now, like physical presence, because one of the things that, she speaks about really powerfully is the role of grief. Yes. And so we also, in shape-shifting, we have to be able to grieve as intentional practice what we are losing. And when we're shifting shape, we're not always happy or good with what we shift into. And there are times when it's beautiful, glorious work, but it's not easy.
I love where you took it, because something that when I have the 15-minute version of the lab days, I don't necessarily mention this. But my first 4 months in government, so basically, I mean, the backstory of that is that, as I mentioned, the mayor of Mexico City offered that I could invent a city department from scratch. And the invitation came completely out of the blue, and I said no several times. But then I was off to a fellowship for 4 months, and I thought, what a beautiful speculative exercise to invent a city department for, again, like the stubborn love of my life. And that it was more almost like an artistic process, if you will, of coming up with a lab. And then I swore that I would get back to Mexico City. It would be wild enough and outlandish enough that the mayor would say no to everything. And then, I would be happy with my exercise and I can go on with life as usual, because besides I loved working in the arts world in so many ways. But then I got back to Mexico City, I presented the idea, and the mayor said, okay, done, we'll announce you in 10 days. And so the threshold between imagination and reality, I think, is another liminal space, is another shape-shifting space. And I agree, I think we have lost this notion of rituals, and that they are proper initiations, but the body does not forget. So in 4 months' time, I got typhoid, I passed a kidney stone for the first time in my life, and I developed allergies that I had never had. But think about the poetry. I mean, it's a brutal poetry of the body, but it is poetry nonetheless, of the body, from like birthing stones, the body saying, this is you and this is not you, because it was, I mean, I had been civil society for my whole life. Like, I really thought government was going behind enemy lines in many ways. But that leads me to my second point in terms of shape-shifting. So absolutely, yes, like this is not without its pains. And besides finding those thorough lines of the things that you keep, what you stay true to, and at the same time know that there's worlds beyond you and selves beyond who you are at right now that are worth exploring, I think is incredibly important. And simultaneously, when I was in government, I found that I had a very stagnant imagination of what government was, and that the first person that I needed to convince, because all of my team, I didn't mention that, but all of my team also came from civil society, and we were supposed to be a strange attractor and a bridge between civil society and government. So if I didn't convince myself first, like how would I convince anybody else? And one of I remember a line in De Profundis from Oscar Wilde that talks about that. Like many of the ills of the world are rather imagination gone stagnant, and I think bringing back to life these things, and many places gone wrong, such as government, because everything that they say about the swampy parts of government are many times true. But if you start thinking of government a different way that really touches upon everything that we hold dear, like it even has to do with our sex life, for God's sakes, like it doesn't get more intimate than that, no? So how do we actually bring this back to life? And as I mentioned, travel back to first principles. And so that hybridity of practice, where I think, we have a saying in Mexico City called un, dos, tres por mí y todos mis compañeros, which is like 1, 2, 3 for me and all of my companions, which is like opening a door and then letting everybody else in. So that's also, I think, part of the shape-shifting, no? That you have to become part of something else, and you actually have to stand for a while at the doorway to actually allow for more flow and more movement to happen between worlds. And since then, it's become, yes, I acknowledge the pains, but I also think that there's a big celebration and a big joy that comes from the capacity of transmutation. And I think that the world is demanding it right now in everything from composting that you mentioned to finding our poetic selves to, so yes, shape-shifting.
I guess maybe I'll just keep it quick because I'm curious for the conversation. But for me, it makes me think of, because maybe like I'm dealing with language in the poems, it makes me think of the idea of in linguistics where they talk about code switching. And I think as someone, a lot of people here can relate to the experience of like having to navigate different cultures, different classes, different social registers. And you know, you start doing that work often at a very young age, and you're trying to work out like all these different paracosms or kind of artificial realities that somehow are telling, every one of them is telling you it's more real than all the other ones. And if you're growing up with a sense of precarity or a sense where you need to learn the different codes just in order to like do simple day-to-day things, like how you talk at home is not how you can talk at school, it's not how you can talk in the shops, it's not how you can talk in ends, it's not how you can talk to like, I don't know, the police, you know. And I think that switching actually is often, if people don't know the codes that you're speaking to, it's often perceived as a deceitful thing.
Yes.
You know? They think you're not being true. And you're like, nah fam, I need to do this just to survive. You know? And the people that don't need to switch codes, to me that's privilege, you know?
Say it again!
Because their code is already socially favored to the point that they always land.
Yes.
Whereas I'm switching because I have a desperate need to be heard. So I'm going to speak your language because you won't hear me if I speak mine. And furthermore, I don't even know what's my language. My language is the symphony of languages.
That's right.
You know?
Yes.
So, yeah.
Okay, I'm just a bit concerned about time, so I'm going to open this up because I think, yes, if that's okay. Yeah. And yes, and that also we might have some online questions as well. No online. Okay.
Hey, thank you so much. I wanted to highlight a few quick things, I think. For me, radical dreaming, it demands radical healing, and radical healing, it demands radical dreaming. And so this entire session has really supported my radical healing and dreaming. I wanted to highlight that disabled people are experts in creating infinite imagination through limitations. So how can we center disabled people in experiments in imagination for our radical and collective liberation? Thank you so much.
Who wants to take that question?
At the risk of it sounding, thank you, Suleiman. So at the risk of it sounding like a cliche, we can't have collective liberation without disability justice. And disability justice requires that we center disabled folk. And for me, that, like, my attention is always on Black global majority disabled folk who are marginalized within the broader disability rights movement spaces, and also kind of thinking about what it means to queer or disability rights spaces, etc. So, like, I'm learning all the time from folk who are deeper in disability justice work than I am about the space of imagination. Like, I'm here because my disability justice people have allowed me to be here, who have taught me, is what I would say about that. Like, we're not free, as Audre Lorde said, can't be free while any woman is unfree, but I believe that we can't be free unless, we can't be free while any human and more than human is unfree. So, yeah.
Can I take another question? Yes. Yep.
Does anyone else?
Thank you.
Hello? Oh, yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, I was really intrigued by Gabriella's approach, you know, like having to go across enemy lines, actually trying to be as outrageous and like, you know, to try and self-sabotage so you didn't have to do that. But it seemed like a little bit of an exercise of putting your money where your mouth is, in a way. They're like, yeah, you're demanding change, here it is. come on in, do it, what you actually want to do. But one thing I remember you saying early on in your presentation was about this idea of like democracy. And I feel like the way that democracy is kind of, how to say, like systemically, you know, through the systems that we have, the avenues that we have, it's really perverse from the actual idea. I find it really strange that our perception, at least from an image standpoint or from like our bodily standpoint, is to either slip a paper with a tiny note on it into a ballot box and hope to ask someone to do it on your behalf, or apparently you stand in a large crowd, yell at people abstractly, and then hope that whoever is in charge of that thing does it for you. And also, really, really like dislike, you know, all these super white, like liberal, like environmental activists that are talking about eco-anxiety for the first time and like whinging about it a lot, as if it was only something that appeared maybe within the last 10 years. Patting themselves on the back for doing direct action when direct action isn't even direct. You're still asking daddy to open his wallet and do something for you. So I really applaud that kind of like effort to like, oh yeah, so the question is basically, how do we, yeah, because I've been thinking about this for a very long time, okay? But it's like, how do we reconceptualize our notion of democracy to make it like functional in a way, I guess, to truly represent the aspirations of democracy?
I think it's a particularly gargantuan question nowadays because I think we all feel in our guts that there is a democratic crisis. And I do think that part of it has been of what I was speaking about in the presentation, that we've pretended that we can have a technocratic stance on everything, that everything is a numbers game, that we are rational and reasonable creatures above all. But as I was talking with David over the break, and this is where I think culture and poetry has so much to speak to democracy, interestingly enough, is that that's actually not necessarily how we've made meaning historically. You know, that there have been so many tools of how we've been able to imagine ourselves as a collective body, if you will, or how we've imagined our way forward. And I think government in many ways has lost the capacity to use these tools. So that is one thought that I'll park for a second and then go to the other bit, which basically is that one of the things that I realized when I stepped into government is that politics is too important to be left only to politicians. Mm-hmm. That policy, for example, is an amazing tool to make reality malleable. So if you ask me, you know, what is the thing that I've loved about art and what it was that I loved about government, it's actually that there are more imaginative realities to be had in mysterious ways sometimes. But there's many tools, like everything from budget to urban imaginaries to political imagination to being able to convene people for a specific urban agenda that are so damn powerful. And I've been fortunate enough, to be, as I mentioned, really well accompanied with my team and all of the collaborators that we had during my time in government. But nowadays I work with, let's say, the mayor of Bogota, or I was also telling David something that just happened 2 weeks ago. I'm working with the vice president of Colombia, who's the first Afro-Colombian woman to be in such high power in the history of Latin America. She was quite recently a domestic worker, a land activist since age 13, a land defender, and now she's in politics. So the politics that Francia Marquez embodies is about collective community care, other forms of knowledge, is bringing in even a different language into politics, and it is such an exciting adventure. So I have the feeling that these are the things that we need to let in, and to really gather forces and momentum and create strange attractors around people such as Francia that embody a very different way of doing politics. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you for your interventions tonight. I've been thinking a lot about, I'm Ndebele Kalanga, which is from Zimbabwe, and in Ndebele, our word for what has been known as witch doctors is Izangoma, which is people of the song. So today, your incantations, for want of a better word, have really felt like those incantations that might have been known from ancient times. My question is, as a creative who's looking at and working with ancient stories, that I'm reading because I do think they have such wisdoms in them, and encountering narratives that I found particularly ableist and quite misogynistic. I'm really struggling to metabolize these for the next generation, which is part of what I feel is my role as an artist. There's a lot that I think I want to treasure. I think language especially codifies a culture, and our word for truth is very similar roots with strength in Ndebele and Zulu. These things are really important to me and precious, but I'm struggling with the more, I guess, like the poisonous bits. So, like most poisons can also be medicines, it's how we use them. So I wanted to ask for your thoughts on that.
Yes. Okay. Now we're talking. So I just want to thank you for doing that labor. I don't think there's an easy way to do this apart. My daughter has talked to me at different points in time about hacking representation. And I think, despite myself, for example, love Jamaican dancehall, which has a lot of questionable things in it. And many of us either disengage or queer dancehall or flip it or right? And so I think there's something around, we are in a moment in terms of a broader hybridity and connection that allows us to take what was and say, how do I bring this into the now? And how do I recognize that that was the thing? And actually, I'm going to reimagine this. And that's the space of the imagination. And people do that all the time. People do it with Greco-Roman art. People do it all the time. And I'm like, because of my Caribbean identity, I'm having to do that. So I'm having to go, I don't know if Yemoja is here for me in that way, but I'm making sure that she is, right? And so there's something about literally actually just doing it, like taking it and saying it was that, and I'm redefining it and reimagining it as this. Because that's the beauty of art. That's the beauty of story. You can take it and you can go, I'm sorry for the children, sorry in terms of the children, we'll fuck it up. Like, I'm going to twist it up and reshape it and shape-shift this piece that is meant to be set in stone. I believe in that. Like, if we're not evolving, then what we're doing?
Sorry, can I just add to that as well? I think, and a very courageous question to ask, and I think there is a discussion to be had about ambivalence and appropriation, which we've all talked about, but we haven't really got down to that, the idea that somehow we are attracted to some things, but we somehow repelled by them, but the idea that we want to, we are appropriated, but we want to be somehow positively appropriated and be somehow not in control, but actually have the narrative in that appropriation discourse, which I feel like you've all talked about, and but you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think just to add a quick point on this, maybe it's relevant, is I think the idea of a fetish is very important in this regard, because one of the definitions of a fetish is what someone else needs you to be in order for their worldview to stay intact. Yeah. So I know fetishes are often referred to in different contexts, but if you think about it on a very basic level, it's just someone telling you, I need you to be like this, or I just need this part of you in order for me to feel good about the reality that I exist in. And so if you're being approached on that level, and you feel like you're becoming subsumed into someone's fetish through the act of performing something authentic to yourself, or a part of yourself is being accepted but other parts are being disregarded, that's where it gets problematic. I think that's for me where I draw the line, and I think actually the other way to see it is that someone accepts you for who you are. They're really curious and kind of, you don't have this idea that you need to be pigeonholed or put into a certain lens or particularity in order to be accepted. And I think that's the conversation that's hard to have, because no one's going to ever admit to you that they're treating you as a fetish. But I feel like that's where the work happens, in these kind of spaces. And I think these spaces are important. Like, I came up in spaces like this, not the art world. You know, David just saw me at some point in Jessica, and, you know, they were just like, what you're doing over there, come do it over here. Like, it wasn't really like, I wasn't trying to be an artist. I had trained as a doctor. So, like, for me, this is the thing which I've noticed, is that actually having these spaces where you can ask those questions and figure out, like, where's the line that we need to draw. And it's an ongoing conversation, because they're moving the lines. Yeah.
And look after yourself.
Yes, and look after yourself.
Look after yourself. Yeah.
Does that work?
Yeah,
there we go. Thank you so much. I'm Rupin. Hi. The one thing that struck me about hearing all of you speak is how interdimensional it felt. And I've really been meditating on the non-linear nature of time, you know, the cyclical nature of time, and this idea that, so I believe in previous lives, I'm religious, I'm Sikh. And, you know, the ancestors knew that. That's what the idea of samsara is, the cyclical nature of time. And we're living every single lifetime at once. And all you have to do is just reach through the veil and pull out a new experience. And this idea of Maya, this idea of delusion, of my fear of being sucked into a corporation and then never living the reality that I feel I need to live. My kind of academic interests are around the New Age and appropriation. So I'd finished a master's and I did it on yoga, capitalism and racism. So looking at, you know, the commodification of yoga and what were previously revolutionary spiritual practices have been apoliticized, in inverted commas. They're not apolitical, but, you know, those things have been taken out of them. And a scholar called Amanda J. Lucia talks about, you know, these wellness festivals as white utopias. And, you know, they've taken all the cultural continuation of colonialism, and they're not revolutionary anymore. And that's what I loved when you were talking about shape-shifting and you were talking about the use of magic in Haiti, was how, you know, where my imagination's going is how do I bring that back to yoga? How do I bring that back to meditation? And there's so much in that. I mean, liberation for us, moksha, liberation, samsara, liberation, it's the same word. So my question is, you know, how does spirituality come into your practice of political and spiritual liberation, and maybe some ideas to help my imagination of how can I break yoga and meditation out of those chains?
That's a big one. Who wants to take that one on? It's something which obviously they've all reflected on. I'm not quite sure if does somebody want to respond? I think it's what you've asked is actually, I think you've just kind of named the next forum, to be honest. Okay, I don't want to not do justice, but I think if there's a response, but I think also a response is also processing as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult thing, right? Like, I struggle with it myself. I talk about Zarathustra and ancient Persian traditions, etc., and how I'm trying to. I never lived in Iran, you know. I'm from West London. Like, and I think, so I'm gonna frame it within my current work at the moment in the sense that like, the way I am perceived within an art context is very much dictated by the logic of the museum and the gallery space. And within that context, people like myself and many of us here are ethnographic objects. It's very hard to not be that. So that's why my work looks the way it does. Like, it doesn't look like art, it doesn't look like anything, it just looks like, what the fuck is this? Like, where's the exhibition? Like, you know? Because as soon as I draw something or anything else, suddenly it becomes a museum object and it follows that logic and it becomes, you know, co-opted. But it doesn't mean that I've succeeded. Like, I haven't. I'm still within that paradigm, but I'm kind of resisting in plain sight for some reason, you know? And it makes me think of another example in the sense that, like, any speech to a police officer is legally accountable. So just talking to a police, suddenly all this apparatus of the law system is kind of like put onto you. Like, there's no way of talking to a police like off the record, or like there's no get out clause to that you talk to police, now anything you say can be taken into court, you can be legally accountable for it, etc. Like, you can't have jokes with police, you can't, like, you know, like, there's just no way out. Like, they've already rigged it, and it's just like, so you talk to police, you accept these terms of engagement, and galleries are similar. You put stuff in the gallery, it becomes art. Like, there's no way out. Like, whatever you put in there, like, they've shown us, like, they can put anything. So it's not interesting anymore to ask what is an artwork. What's interesting to think about is, what is this machinery that is just in place and we never think about it, you know? And I think that's the kind of question you're asking, is like, actually, it's not about like how to find that space of like an authentic thing, because that's what you have inside you. No one can question that. It's more just like, why is it when I do it over here it becomes this, you know? Like, why is it that when they do it over there it becomes that? Like, you know, and it's that kind of question of just like, what is happening on a metaphysical level? You know, and when I say metaphysics, I'm not talking spiritual. I'm saying literally, someone told me this is not a table, you know, and what's going on there? Like that, you know, like, so, and that's literally what's happening like 100 times a day. We're being told things are not what we see them as. And so, like, everything's conceptual. That's why I take the piss when they say my work's conceptual. I'm like, you're fucking conceptual. Like, you know? You know, if I was in a room full of people I relate to, I'd just do lyrics. I don't need to make art. Like, so that's where, like, I think having different spaces is important, and yeah, that's why we're here, and maybe we need a forum about this point. Yeah.
That's a big question.
I think we can. I think of my spiritual practice not as a place to get to, but as a way that I move through the world. I don't know my political self without my spiritual self. I don't know my artistic self without my spiritual self. I can't show up here without whatever my prayer happens to be. And there are ways that I have become quite stink with it. So the reason I do ancestral call at the start of everything I do is because that is important to me. Whether the audience gets it or not is irrelevant. And whether it is tidy or not is irrelevant, because that, for me, is important in terms of honoring my ancestors, everybody behind me, and when I walk into a room, people talk about rolling Ted Man deep. I roll hundreds of ancestors deep. Yeah? And I can't say that that was taught to me in a proper way. Because particularly for those of us in diaspora, and if you've had legacies of enslavement where they told you that your spiritual practice was all corrupt and wrong anyway, we're having to reimagine and rediscover. So that requires us being able to do what we're doing with our chest, right? And it's not tidy and it's not perfect, but we have to claim it as our own, even if Europeans commodify the thing. In Brazil, they've made Yamaya white in different places, the dark-skinned goddess, right? And you know, and there's I look at it and I'm like, how the hell, right? But that's kind of, because she's been mixed with Virgin Mary, that was a survival strategy, but also there's a corruption. Does it mean that Yamaya doesn't do what she needs to do? I would argue that she shows up however she needs to show up. And so there is something about us being able to hold it irrespective of what has been done to it, because the essence remains pure.
I'm really sorry, but I've got to wind up. I really do feel that some of the questions that have been raised requires us to think about other forums to kind of think through some of these questions and some of these dialogues. Very difficult to kind of bring it all together because there's been a lot that's been said. I always feel that when the energy is at this point, that somehow we need that time to process things that have been said, things that we wanted to say, but can bring back into other forums, things that can be taken into other forums. But please note this, that when you leave today, there is no doubt that to be one of the imagination, it requires courage, it requires patience, it requires perseverance, and it requires the level of infrastructure and collegiality that only we can bring together. So let's thank our speakers and let's continue this dialogue in the future.